Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's actually an interesting change for me to be able to talk to an audience like this about workplace accommodations, because it's not often that workplace accommodations get a seat at this kind of table. It's generally talked about for younger people and for in rehab and for voc rehab, but it doesn't often get into an audience like this. So that makes it especially interesting for me. Let me just start by talking about the importance of workplace participation and community integration in terms of workplace accommodations. Workplace accommodations support job functions. They support the execution of work-related tasks, coordination of group and collaborative activities, transmission of office culture, and team building. And there's a large body of research related to that. It also enhances work outcomes in terms of higher individual and firm productivity, increased satisfaction, and less turnover intention. And there's some research to that as well. So workplace accommodations have some positive benefits for individuals who work and for the firms they work for, but that's not why we have workplace accommodations. That's not the driving force. The driving force is that they're mandated by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And they're a little different than other facilities, other environments in which the ADA has or may not have a say. For example, in public facilities, and actually as was pointed out in Lisa's question this morning about public environments, a lot of that is mandated in Title III, which has technical requirements for what needs to be done. Unfortunately, for public environments and streets, there isn't much to be said in the ADA, and so that's why we have big potholes that don't get fixed. The workplace is a little different. In the workplace, although it's mandated in Title I, they mandate reasonable accommodations. Reasonable accommodations aren't technical requirements for what should be done, like in a public environment where you have to have a 1 in 12 ramp, for example, and specific grab bars at toilets. In the workplace, it's reasonable. Reasonable, and the next slide will talk about that, doesn't mandate what has to be done. It mandates that something should be done. And then there's housing, which we've talked about, and Rory talked about some of the work they've done. Housing's not mandated at all. It comes under sort of this rubric of, if you can get it done, that's great, but there's no requirement to do it whatsoever, at least in single-family or two-family homes. So basically, we have home modifications, which are modified to the context and for the individual. And reasonable accommodations are somewhat like that. That is, they're contextual. And as defined by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the definition of reasonable accommodation is any change in the work environment or in the way things are customarily done that enables an individual with a disability to enjoy equal employment opportunities. Under that comes changes to the job application process, changes that enable an employee with a disability to enjoy equal benefits, and changes to the work environment that enables a qualified individual to perform the essential functions of the position. So it's basically contextual. It's whatever needs to be done within reason, and that's often a matter of cost, to make the job accessible to the individual. So what do we generally do? Let me talk a little bit about some of the research that we've done that has looked at what kinds of accommodations are typically made for individuals with disabilities. And we've actually done a series of projects where we've looked at or asked a number of questions about employees with disabilities related to the kinds of accommodations that they've gotten. And most recently, what we've found is that people with vision limitations, for example, get things like accessible documents, reading guides, braille displays, and often get nothing at all. And that tends to vary somewhat between age groups. The younger people tend to get a little more and higher technologies, and older adults, as the chart sort of points out, is that they often don't get anything, certainly not the same kinds of things that younger employees get, and half of them didn't get anything at all.
John, can I ask a question about these data as we go through them?
You can.
Are these, thank you, are these accommodations?
If it doesn't cut into my time.
Are these accommodations meant to imply that they were required in order to permit the person to continue to work? That is, they couldn't do their job without these things?
That would, yes, that would be a good interpretation. In fact, that was one of the questions that we asked in one of the early surveys. I don't have that data here, but something like 90-some-odd% replied that they needed that technology to do the job.
That's very helpful, because you can imagine there might be some accommodations which would be convenient, but in fact the person would have been able to continue to work without them.
Correct, yeah.
But we should interpret these as enabling people to continue to work.
Correct, yes.
Great. Thank you.
People with hearing limitations, actually, we can see that hearing aids became an accommodation that they needed, communication via written information, communicating with devices, sign language, and again, the none provided, there's a fair amount of people, number of employees with that didn't have any. But if you notice, there's a difference in sort of the percentages, and they get inverted as you get older from what we saw with vision in terms of the kinds of accommodations and actually getting any at all. For cognitive limitations, simple things like checklists and reminder devices, timers, but again, a lot of people are not getting anything at all. It's hard to prove that you have a cognitive limitation or even want to ask for it. Mobility limitations, and this actually is data mostly pertaining to workstations and their private workspace. Again, as you see, older adults tend to get fewer modified workstations, although they tend to get ergonomic chairs. It's harder for us to sit in chairs for a while, and that sort of seems to be reasonable for most people. Steps and lifts to get up to their desk, but again, large numbers of individuals with nothing. People with dexterity limitations, not as much technology that used here, equipment modifications and gripping aids, and simple things like carts to move things around so you don't have to carry things. But again, as people get older, the numbers of modifications tend to tail off.
What sorts of occupations were these?
These are across the board. I mean, that was another slide. If I was doing a presentation just on this, I would have included all that. But it represents sort of all the areas of occupations that might be.
Foods, agriculture and construction, fisheries, forestry.
Yeah.
Some of these high-risk professions.
It would.
People get hurt all the time.
Yeah. So the impact, this is off of the last study that we did, and the importance of the modifications on a 3-point scale all ranked at 2 or higher, but interestingly, people's satisfaction with their modifications was somewhat less. So it was important for their job, and to go to the question earlier, these data aren't as striking as the first study that we did, where we had a much higher percentage saying they couldn't do the job without the modifications. But to sort of summarize the use of current technology, obviously it seems that accommodations are important even if individuals are not as satisfied with them as they should be. And the technology often varies with age. Older adults are less likely to get big ticket items such as modified workstations, and then they also receiving no modifications is consistent in terms of increasing with age, except when it comes to hearing loss, which seems to be the thing that is mostly acceptable for older adults, is that, you know, we can't hear so well. But even though technology is important and people say they can't do their jobs without it, there is still an issue of abandonment. We found, whoops, I've lost a slide. There it is. So what we found when we did a follow-up survey with 54 Georgia Voc Rehab clients, we found that 38% never used their accommodations, or they discontinued use within 1 year, and 66 discontinued use within 5 years. So if we look at why it got out of order, 1/3 of the individuals said they left their jobs and left their accommodations behind because they couldn't take them with them. So one employer pays for an accommodation. In fact, we had this with some of our employees that, you know, because we're a state agency, we pay for the accommodation, and they couldn't take it with them, even though, oh, we have no use for it now. So it sits either on a shelf or in a closet, wasted, and we couldn't let that person take their accommodation with them. And then 1/3 were outdated technology. So as technology increases, there's a need for new accommodations that work better. Even though there's a current use and a fairly widespread use of accommodations amongst people with employees in the workplace, there's still a barrier to integration and participation. And there's sort of the common list, the obvious barriers to obtaining technologies. There's attitudes on the parts of employers and on coworkers because, well, maybe it's giving people an advantage. They're getting something that I don't have. There's awareness, knowing about them at all. Accessibility, being able to get to the technologies. And these are sort of the obvious barriers that cut across not just workplace accommodations, but home modifications and any other types of assistive technology. The availability, the acceptance, the affordability. So I had more A's than Rory did. It makes me feel better. But there were some hidden barriers to obtaining all the right technology. And this is particularly related to participation. Oh, and these start with A too, isn't that funny? So, activity, accessibility, ADA. These are all the things that we don't think about in terms of participation. And let me tell you what I mean by this. Workplace activity versus workplace participation. All of the technologies that I talked about are addressing workplace activity. The ADA and the Equal Opportunity Commission talks about activity. It's all about executing individual work tasks. This workshop, and the title of the workshop, is about participation. Participation is more of a shared experience that creates a sense of belonging. And that accommodations, as defined in the ADA, and about accessibility are all about engaging job tasks done by oneself or perhaps with others, but not engaging in interactions and work experiences. The examples of activities might be screen readers, assistive listening systems, access to one's own workstation, as I talked about earlier, but access to other workstations, informal conversations, meetings, social events, sort of what Rory was talking about earlier about visitability. That is, that's what creates participation. Examples might be, I had my students talk about or draft up some examples of what activity might be at a workstation for teleworking. And here's an example of you can conduct work activities, but can you participate? Maybe. To the contrary, if you had some wheels, you could get around. And you might be able to participate in a much better way. Even the measures of success would be different. So for activity, it's independence, quality, efficiency, and productivity. For participation, it's a sense of belonging, inclusion, and recognition that your work has added value to the organization. So part of the problem is we're stuck in an ADA paradigm. The ADA is this 20th century paradigm that inclusion, that is participation, follows function. We provide accommodation for work tasks, which allows us to do activity performance, and that should engender participation in general. So far, it really hasn't happened, and I'll talk a little bit about a study that we did to show that. In contrast, the ICF is a 21st century paradigm. It talks about activity and participation being linked, but it talks about them as independent and equally important outcomes. It suggests that we need accommodations for work tasks for activity performance, but we also need accommodations for inclusive interactions and for participation. So we did a study, and we looked at employees with disabilities and employees without disabilities. We looked at employees that claimed to have their accommodation needs met for individual workspaces. That would be reasonable accommodations for activity. And we also asked them about their needs being met for accommodations in shared spaces where there wouldn't be their essential job functions, but they would be part of their employment. We found that three of our 50 employees with disabilities actually had all but three, so 47 out of 50 had their needs met for accommodations in their individual workspaces, but half of them didn't have their needs met for shared workspaces. Very significant differences. And if we look at the types of accommodations, they had unmet needs for communication, or all their needs were met for communication for their workstation, all but 2% for the office entrance, and for their computer only 4%. But if you look at the common spaces where people would be able to either participate formally or informally, the building entrance, moving around, and furniture in the modifications in the office or the spaces in general were much higher. The level of dissatisfaction with activity and participation outcomes we found was remarkably different as well. That people with unmet needs for activity type accommodations, only 8% were dissatisfied with their work. On the other, or 8%, sorry, with unmet needs, and 0%. So everybody that had their needs met was happy. But if we look at people with unmet needs for participation, it goes for informal participation all the way up to 48% for people who didn't have their needs met. So there's this link between satisfaction with the work and the workplace, and having their needs met, either for activity and or participation. The interesting thing here is that when we look at people who had their needs met, people with disability who had their needs met, they weren't statistically different in terms of their participation outcomes from people who didn't have disabilities at all. Yet there were statistical differences between people who had unmet needs and people who had their needs met in terms of their participation. So the policy implications of this is that it suggests that the ADA assumptions about activity leading to participation are not really being supported. In the ICF, activity and participation are independent constructs, and they require different types of technologies for accommodation. It requires a paradigm shift from providing technologies to accommodate activity to technologies that facilitate both activity and participation. So what do some of these technologies look like? What possibly could we be looking forward to? We had a State of the Science conference, which is required for all the RERCs that NIDR supports, And the theme of our RERC last year was, our State of the Science last year, were the potential of emerging technologies to increase participation of employees with disabilities. And the technology areas that tended to come up and were focused on robotics, social media, gaming, augmented reality, and universal design. In terms of robotics, telepresence robots bring remote workers into, can bring them into collaborative teams to work together. It can provide remote coaching and training, provide verbal and video cues. It can monitor multiple people in multiple locations. So it can bring people together by using more or less a video or Skype that's on wheels that can roll around and follow you around. Collaborative software and social media can enable distributed groups to work together, having web-based communities that can enhance work-related social interaction, social inclusion, and networking. And as was pointed out earlier this morning, the social media don't recognize disability. It puts everybody on an even keel. Gaming platforms and virtual worlds, they can be used in training and engaging in a way to practice repetitive skills, but they can also create simulated online environments, again, in which users interact and create objects, for example, in Second Life, that can act as representatives of themselves in virtual worlds. Augmented reality involves superimposing content onto a scene and is used as a navigation tool for coaching specific jobs and job training. And then finally, universal design, which has been talked about a little bit this morning, several presentations. Joe Coughlin talked a lot about it, although he sort of treated it like Voldemort, sort of the technology solution that shall not be named. But it's about putting universal design into the workplace. We talk a lot about putting it in homes and housing in our products, but we don't talk a lot about putting it in the workplace. But the beauty of universal design is that it is an ICF compatible paradigm. It isn't about accessibility and engendering participation. It's about accommodating both activity and accessibility and participation at the same time. And it's incorporating the thinking of assistive technology into everyday design. It's not something special that you go and buy at a rehab store. It's something that you do find at Best Buy or at Target or at Home Depot or the grocery store. It's just about creating general products for everybody. And because of this, it benefits multiple workers with and without disabilities across an employee's work life and across individuals. So if somebody has to leave an accommodation behind, it's actually an accommodation they found there in the first place because it was already there, and it's usable by somebody else. It doesn't end up in a closet. It reduces the amount of time to start work or return to work because it's already there when you get there. It reduces the need and the cost of individualized technology. It doesn't replace it. It doesn't obviate the need for it altogether, but it reduces the need. It reduces abandonment and obsolescence, and it facilitates group work and promotes social inclusion. Thank you. I'd also like to point out that most of the work supported here was funded by the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research as part of the RERC on workplace accommodations.
Thank you, John.